What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the channel. My name is Michael and I hope you are having an awesome day. We got some more Sabaton history today. This time it is Rise of Evil, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Once again, Sabaton history. Drop a like, you know what time it is. Let's go.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Joachim from Sabaton.
And this is Sabaton History. Adolf Hitler's rise to power was as unlikely as his rule was catastrophic.
And our song Rise of Evil is quite unusual in the sense that it doesn't cover an armed conflict.
And he's going to tell you about the song, but first, I'm going to tell you the history. Now we're just getting started. We have the power, and we're not going to give it up again. With these prescient words, Adolf Hitler greeted his party members on February 5th, 1933, a few days after he was officially declared the new Chancellor of Germany. The National Socialists, his party, known also as the NSDAP, or the Nazi Party, is now the biggest party in the Reichstag, the parliament, with 33% of the seats. Now, the Communist Party has 16.9%.
So I kind of like how they, well, like's not the right word, but the display of the way they do it. So we have the Communist Party on the far left right there, and then we have the, extreme radical right wing, which is the Nazis, on the opposite end. Very interesting.
That means that the conservative center-right and liberal center-left parties, opposed to both the communists and the Nazis, as well as each other, don't have the majority needed to form a government. Instead, under leadership of a conservative and Catholic bloc, many of the mainstream MPs plan to simply control the ambitious Hitler when he is chancellor. But Hitler was determined. His goal was to get nothing less than absolute power. He would destroy the parliamentary system, which he very much despised, and establish his Führerdiktatur by any and all means necessary. But to rise above the others, Hitler had to win over the general public, large private interests, and the powerful elements of the government and the military first. His first speech as the Chancellor of the Reich was a roundup of the topics he had unceasingly spoken about since the beginning of his political career in the pubs of Munich after the First World War. But Hitler had perfected the art of public speaking, and he really knew how to work a crowd and how to paint pictures in the minds of...
So one of the questions that's always posed is you look at who are the best public speakers of all time. And right off the top of the head, you can name one, Martin Luther King Jr., fabulous public speaker. But then somebody that, a figure that nobody really wants to put in that same conversation, but should be there, is Adolf Hitler. The man was able to get the entire country to see his ideology. Not necessarily support it, but to see it. And look what happened afterwards. And if you watch any of his interviews and the way he conducts himself, the man is an incredibly gifted public speaker.
Of his listeners. He spoke of the years of Marxist influence that had ruined the German economy, how the Treaty of Versailles, dictated by the malevolent victors of the war, had left the once glorious German Empire fragmented and its people impoverished. And as the listeners grew emotional, Hitler promised that he would destroy Marxism with fire and sword and free Germany from the poisonous class struggle. Under his leadership, German society would find its way back to conservative Christian values and find renewed pride in its past. This turned non-Nazi tacit acceptance of Hitler into actual sympathy, especially from the right end of the political spectrum.
Wow.
However, while Hitler spoke of peace and prosperity to the public, he shifted to a bellicose, threatening, and more sinister tone in more private conversations. Just a few days after becoming chancellor, he met with the highest generals of the Reichswehr, Germany's handicapped army. Germany's future, Hitler insisted, is depending on the Wehrmacht and the Wehrmacht alone. Pacifism was unworthy of Germany's heritage, and according to Hitler's social Darwinistic views, Germany had to fight its way back to great power status. Getting back lost colonies was one idea, but conquering Lebensraum in Europe's east and pursuing a ruthless Germanization was preferable to Hitler and the Nazis. Either way, to be in a position to make demands of the world, Germany's military had to undergo a massive buildup, despite the limitations imposed by the Versailles Treaty. This was exactly what Germany's military had to undergo a massive buildup, despite the limitations imposed by
bikes. How OG is that? That's like way back when, riding bikes. Crazy to think that that was a form of, you know, transportation back in the day. They're using bikes. Like, that's just crazy how far we have advanced from where we are, or where we were then to now.
By the Versailles Treaty.
Crazy.
This was exactly what those generals most wanted to hear. A strong military would consequently elevate their own positions in German society.
A nation in despair, weakened by war defeated, lost of pride in the sight.
Ooh.
A former prisoner with a vision or delusion, rise to power in the Reich.
As the next step, Hitler met with another powerful group, the industrials. Many shareholders of the big companies, such as IG Farben or Krupp, were initially distrustful of Hitler and his party, especially the word socialist in National Socialist Party. That had a lot of them worried that radical economic changes that would negatively affect them were on the horizon. Today, in 2019, there is still a debate among historians as to how socialists, the National Socialists, actually were. In terms of social policy, they were on the extreme reactionary right. Opinions vary as to their economic policy, and they likely always will. But one thing was pretty certain about the party back then. The NSDAP was broke. Election campaigns are expensive.
Yeah, see, that's the question that, it's really cool. I was literally about to address that. It's like the National Socialist Party, but then it's a far-right radical movement. So is there really socialism there, or is it more so nationalism? So it's an interesting the fact that they went for the socialistic aspect in their title instead of like a nationalistic approach.
And the lavish style of the Nazis with all the uniforms, banners, and parades was a real drain on funds. Hitler convinced the industrials, though, that socialist was a rather flexible term and that their powerful position would go untouched under his rule. Instead, there would be a lot of new contracts for them from the armament industry. Again, Hitler's speaking skills transformed suspicious listeners to excited followers. And by the end of the meeting, the NSDAP coffers were filled with 3 million Reichsmarks. You gotta spend money to make money, right? Now, with the support of both the military and industry, Hitler turned to his internal enemies. He made fellow Nazi Hermann Goering, famous World War I fighter pilot, and in 1933 president of the Reichstag and minister without portfolio, Reichskommissar of the Prussian Department of the Interior, and minister-president of Prussia, which meant nothing less than that Goering now commanded both the police and the administration of the Prussian state. And he immediately purged both institutions of enemies of the Nazis and formed the Gestapo, the secret police. The Nazi paramilitary organizations SS, SA, and Stahlhelm now ran rampant, targeting their enemies and settling scores both old and new. Their victims were mostly communists and social democrats at this point. But other critics of the Nazis fell prey to the violent mob or to corrupt police officers. They busted up election meetings. They jumped and arrested people on the streets or dragged them out of their homes at night. In the brown barracks, the enemies of the Nazis were brutally beaten, tortured, and often outright killed without consequence for the murderers. It was a brutal terror that swept the Prussian state, but was in fact only an omen of what was to come for the rest of the country once the Nazis got control of the entire government system. Officially, this was explained by Hitler as preventing the imminent communist revolution. That actually was believed by large parts of the public because the danger of the communist threat, the Red Scare, had been hyped by politicians across the spectrum since World War I. The Reichstag fire, the burning of the German parliament building on February 27th, was just another catalyst to further escalate the violence. To this day, there are those who believe that the Nazis were actually behind the attack on the Reichstag, although there is no direct evidence of this.
A government using their own attack to force a political agenda. Where have we heard that before? Everywhere. Every government's done it throughout history.
And in his diaries, Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propagandist, and in February 1933, soon-to-be Minister of Propaganda, gives no hints about it. But the lone Dutch communist was captured at the scene, gave Hitler the chance to push the first of many emergency laws through Parliament. As a response to the attack, the basic rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press were immediately suspended, as was the power of the individual German states.
Rebuilding an army, make the nation proud. Disregarding the treaty, secret plans for Lebensraum. Stop the Holocaust, the Reich will rise.
The terror now swept nationwide as the Gleichschaltung, the co-option of the interior ministries under Nazi rule, took effect under these emergency laws. Bit by bit, the positions in the governments of German cities and states were taken over by Nazi Party members. All police and security forces were by mid-1934 under direct control of the SS, Schutzstaffel, and its leader, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler appoints Theodor Eicke to head up the Dachau camp, and Eicke proceeds to formalize what had been a spontaneously created concentration camp system. An atmosphere of violence and fear gripped every German city in those days, and everyone knew that people could simply disappear and find themselves in the laboratory of violence. That's what the German historian Volker Ulrich called Dachau in those days. Among those people who disappeared were Jews, the main villains in Hitler's worldview. Now, the takeover by Hitler triggered some rather negative reactions abroad. So the Nazis claim, with no evidence, that this is because Jews are spreading false stories of atrocities committed in Germany. In retaliation for the fictional crimes, on April 1st, 1933, the Nazis called for a nationwide boycott of Jewish stores, doctors, and lawyers. Although the boycott gains little traction and only really lasts for a day, Jews were now the official enemy of the state, and the legal discrimination against Jews was soon followed by physical violence. This was very unpopular with large parts of the general public, but there was no substantial resistance among the people either. Just apathy. The terror had already done its work, and the people were terrified.
You know, the fact that this is like the first one that I have seen that's not exactly a military conflict, you know, it looks like 20 episodes in at this point in time. It's a nice change of pace because I think it's important to talk about the backstory of what happened to lead to the conflict that we see in what Sabaton talks about quite a bit. So it's definitely like a behind-the-scenes approach that is much appreciated.
And the violence and discrimination against the Jews would only increase year by year until the pogroms of Kristallnacht of 1938, when Jews were killed or sent to camps by the thousands, their synagogues burned, their homes, prayer rooms, and graveyards destroyed. Beginning November 1938, they are incarcerated simply for being Jews. Back again in 1933, on May 1st, the National Socialist Party celebrated the Tag der Arbeit, Labor Day, as an official holiday with huge parades and tens of thousands of workers listening to Hitler's speeches on the radio. Hitler had promised to reduce the high unemployment rate by gigantic construction projects like the Autobahn. Fairly short-term solution, sure, but the idea worked, and the traditional left-leaning workers put their trust in Hitler. The next day, the last real threat to Nazi rule that could have united large parts of society, the unions, accepted their dissolution without a fight.
Wow.
Instead, the NSDAP had gained over 2 million members in just those 3 months of 1933 alone, and the Nazis had successfully destroyed any opposition to their rule. Everyone who thought Hitler controllable, everyone who thought the Nazis would never gain real power, and everyone who had hesitated to organize a coordinated resistance to the violence was now rendered powerless. The Nazis had taken control over every vital institution in Germany, and they were not about to give up that power. The swastika flew next to the national colors and would soon replace them as the flag of the German Reich. From the very beginning, Hitler had not only been determined to obtain absolute power, but he had also been completely open about his plans. His ambitions declared in his book Mein Kampf were by no means a secret, but nearly everybody had underestimated the ruthlessness of the former corporal from Austria. One party, one belief, one conviction, as Goebbels dictated. All other parties must be eradicated, and only the Nazi Party shall remain.
Interesting. very interesting to kind of see the backstory. You know, being American history is obviously a little bit different, and it's oftentimes very, very hard to see what's actually truth and what's not because there's biases involved, there's perspective, who's writing it. It's interesting to open your awareness to some of this. You know, it's not something that's, you know, we learn about it in history, but it's not as big of the event or discussed as the actual military conflicts within the war.
With Germany under his control, Hitler moved on to the next phase of his grand vision. His gaze wandered outwards, across the borders drawn in 1919. The Fuhrer looked towards Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Lithuania, to the countries that he saw as bearing the stigma of the Versailles Treaty, nations where a large ethnic German population lived under what Hitler considered foreign rule. Reversing or breaking that treaty was the next step in Hitler's plans, but that would take time to prepare. And until then, Hitler had to rely on bait-and-switch tactics. Dishonesty was his weapon of choice, to test the weakness and the gullibility of the other European powers. While the Wehrmacht was preparing and rebuilding under the swastika, the Fuhrer's plans for the expansion of the Third Reich were set in motion. Hitler was growing ready to wager Germany's future in an all-or-nothing gamble. There would be no 1918 ever again. Germany would return to glory, or it would perish.
Interesting to see that background, to say the least. But anyways, I'm excited to go check out the Rise of Evil, Sabaton song. I really am. Definitely interesting to see Sabaton, and I feel like it's the type of band where you get more and more interested as you learn more and more about the band. But anyways, Rise of Evil, Sabaton history. Be sure to go check out Rise of Evil. I'm doing it right after this reaction. And as always, for me, stay healthy, stay happy, and have a blessed day. Peace.